The Philippine elections are just 4 days away. The stakes are high, and so is the tension. Past polls have been marred by allegations of electoral fraud and vote buying, and it's no different this time around.
With campaigning in its final stretch, the mudslinging and propaganda machines are working overtime. The pandemic has altered strategies, with the main battlefield shifting to social media. And with the top seat in the land in contention, candidates are tapping every tool in their arsenals. Filipinos are electing President Rodrigo Duterte's successor. The winner will serve a 6-year term alongside the vice president. Now, many other national and local positions are also up for grabs. The Philippines has a total of 24 senators, but only 12 seats will be open on election day. Lawmakers holding the others are still halfway through their terms. 316 seats will be filled in the House of Representatives. 253 seats are for legislative members of Congress, while the other 63 are for party list groups standing for marginalized sectors. The president needs to have command of both chambers of Congress to be able to push legislation through. But it's also the main breeding ground of any effort to unseat the country's leader, particularly through impeachment. Roughly 18,000 other local positions, from governors and mayors to city councillors, are also at stake. 68 million of the country's 110 million strong population are eligible to vote. The vast majority of ballots will be cast on election day. But absentee voters, which include 1.8 million registered overseas Filipinos, have already begun making their choices.
And candidates have been crisscrossing the country for nearly 3 months to try to woo the electorate. But the focus has mainly been on those seeking the government's top seat.
The slate of presidential candidates is wide, but 5 notable names are in focus, given their standing in opinion polls. Leading the pack is Ferdinand Marcos Jr., son and namesake of the late Philippine dictator. The former senator, known as Bongbong, has maintained a decisive lead in surveys, and he might just pave the way for the family's return to the seat of power 36 years after they were kicked out. But his road to Malacanang Palace has been bumpy. His opponents tried to have him disqualified because of his tax evasion conviction dating back to the mid-1990s. The family also has estate tax liabilities worth nearly $4 billion, casting a shadow over his campaign. History, legal trouble, and more. It's made Mr. Marcos one of the most polarizing Philippine presidential candidates ever. He is running under what he calls a unifying brand of leadership. Leni Robredo is trying to stand in his way. The current vice president beat Mr. Marcos for the second highest post when they ran against each other in 2016, but she is trailing far behind in the polls. Ms. Robredo is a former lawyer and human rights activist. She's been a staunch critic of President Rodrigo Duterte's administration, in particular his deadly war on drugs. She's pushing for transparent government and livelihood for everyone in a country where nearly a quarter of the population lives in poverty. Manila Mayor Isko Moreno Damagoso hopes to take his own rags-to-riches story to Malacanang. A scavenger turned former teen idol, he beat his fellow showbiz alum, the deposed former President Joseph Estrada, to hold the top job in the capital city. Senator Ping Lacson is no stranger to the presidential campaign. The former police general's first bid was in 2004 when he lost to then-incumbent President Gloria Arroyo. And finally, boxing champ Manny Pacquiao. He enters a different ring, this time fighting to rule over the entire country. The senator has 12 years of experience as a lawmaker under his belt. He is also an evangelical preacher who takes controversial stances on pivotal issues. President Rodrigo Duterte has not endorsed any candidate, but his political party has backed Mr. Marcos. And now comes the plot twist. President Duterte's daughter, Sarah, is a running mate of Mr. Marcos, whom the president has called weak and lazy. Now, unlike in other countries, Filipinos vote for the vice president separately, which means the new deputy might not be an ally of the winning president. So while candidates may stand on the same platform, they won't necessarily be in power together.
Assistant Professor Lisandro Claudio from the University of California, Berkeley, explains the appeal of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. despite his family's history and legal troubles.
In 1986, there was a poll after Ferdinand Marcos Sr. was deposed, and that poll said that even if his favorability rating was low, that the majority of Filipinos still thought he was a strong leader. So the narrative of Marcos as a strong leader who can kind of unify the country has never really disappeared, and that is the platform on which his son is running on. He's actually running on a very empty campaign. It's policy light. It's running on a nostalgia about a past that never existed, and because of that, it's a kind of Rorschach test that allows his supporters to kind of ascribe to Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and his father's legacy whatever they want to ascribe onto it. I think there's definitely been a shift in the narrative that anchors Philippine politics. From 1986 until roughly 2016, the narrative was a narrative of democratization from the end of the Marcos period until the emergence of the Aquino family, both President Corazon Aquino and President Benigno Aquino III. They were moving forward the narrative. But from Duterte onwards, there's been kind of a recognition on the part, not a recognition, a kind of nostalgia on the part of Filipinos for strongman rule. As early as 2017, for example, there was evidence that around 65 to 70% of Filipinos wanted to experiment with systems apart from democracy. So it's very clear that what's happening globally, the rediscovery of authoritarian politics, the emergence of populists, those trends are, of course, at play in the Philippines.